This is AIM Agenda. With me now, Labor's Peter Khalil and Liberal MP Tim Wilson. Peter, first to you, what are your thoughts on the discussion about whether the military is involved or not in counter-terror operation? It seems to make sense when the thing's complex or long-running, but as Mr Beasley pointed out before the break, it's very hard to see them responding to an event, say, like that in London, heaven forbid, where it's over within 10 minutes. Yeah,
Kieran, hi, good morning. And look, I think two important questions around this issue that's been raised by Andrew Hastie and a couple of other people in the government. There's a tactical operational question and then there's a strategic and legal one. Tactically and operationally, I mean, the question is, one, whether a tag team would actually get there before the primary responders, which are usually the state police or the special operations group. But secondly, it's operational in the sense of who's in charge. Are there protocols in place where you know who's actually making the calls? Is it the military commander on the ground? Is it the police commander? Who's actually making the big calls? And you just want to make sure that in those types of incidents, you've got that right. I'm not saying that we shouldn't look at making sure that there's a streamlined approach where you can actually draw on any type of force to assist these situations, but you have to look at it from that operational sense. On the strategic sense, what concerns me a little bit more is that there is a reason why it's so difficult to bring out the Australian Defence Forces for domestic incidents, and that's because we have a separation of powers, and this is a fundamental principle of our democracy. The Defence Forces are there to protect our sovereignty, to protect our nation state from external aggression. And one could make an argument that we are in a war on terror. We've heard that phrase before, but some people criticise that and say, well, you can't have a war on a tactic. So there's a strategic and a legal question there at a higher level, and we have to be careful about that because the separation of powers between the federal and the state powers are really, really important.
Yeah, well, Andrew Hastie touches on that in his piece in the West Australian, where he says, Tim Wilson, that a terrorist attack, a major attack, is an attack on the Commonwealth. So he sort of addresses that particular issue in terms of the separation of powers. But Tim, your reflections on this discussion we're having as well, more broadly on Islam, and Julie Bishop this morning saying in the interview, I'll run it again after 9 o'clock Eastern, but she says that we need to hear louder voices from moderate Islam, much louder than those of, speaking of radicalisation. What are your reflections on where we're at right now?
Well, firstly, the government is already reviewing the role of the Defence Forces in these types of incidents. But as Peter has outlined, you have first responders on the ground. Proximity says that the state police forces will always be the first point of contact. So the role of Defence Forces always has to be reviewed in light of that and the fact they'll be slower in response times, but they may have more specific skills, but that should be determined based on a case-by-case incident. In terms of moderate voices and Islam, yes, do they need to be louder? Resolutely, yes. We need more people standing up and speaking out and making sure that they're working within their communities and particularly amongst young people to make sure that we're shielding young people against radicalisation. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But what we need to do is make sure that we're working constructively with communities to make sure that they're not actually radicalising young people. We've seen in the past 48 hours the first response of Pauline Hanson's One Nation isn't to grieve with the families of those victims of London or to be able to provide constructive policy suggestions. Sadly, what we're seeing now is some politicians using tragic terrorist events for their own political advantage, and they ought to be ashamed of themselves.
The fact that Pauline Hanson, Peter Khalil, appropriated the actual message of the Metropolitan Police and then changed the wording to suit her own argument. This was just hours after the attack, as Tim alluded to there.
Yeah, look, I think Bill Shorten's response to her was spot on. I mean, it was crass and it was idiotic. I mean, if you look at what she's putting forward as a response, which is to ban migration completely from anyone that's Muslim, it won't work. That's the first point. And she is, as Tim said, using this response for her short-term political gain and not really even thinking about the victims and the families and the people involved and the law enforcement involved in addressing these issues. It's all about her short-term political gain, and it is disgusting in that sense. So I back Bill completely on that. Look, on the question of Muslim communities in the West and abroad, there is this fundamental issue. I mean, people say, oh, the Muslim leaders don't come out and they don't speak up against terrorism, but they are constantly doing that. You've got people in Australia, leaders in Australia who are constantly doing that. I think the fundamental problem, though, is that our law enforcement, our intelligence, our counter-radicalisation programs, our military commitments abroad, while they're all important, in many respects, Kieran, they are kind of like Band-Aids on a gunshot wound. They're not addressing the fundamental core problem here that we're facing, that the globe is facing with Islamic State and this type of extremism, and that is that there is a significant minority within Islam, it's not insignificant, I should say, it's a significant minority, which has an interpretation, an extreme interpretation of the religion, that not only justifies terror but rejects the nation state. It rejects democracy because it ascribes sovereignty only to the divine, and it doesn't accept sovereignty residing amongst the people. That is a fundamental different worldview, and they'll do anything they can, including the barbarity that we've seen, to get to that point of an Islamic state. Now, the vast majority of Muslims don't subscribe to that. Mainstream Sunni and Shia Muslims don't subscribe to that. And her putting them in that basket only creates division and makes our fight even worse. They are our allies in this, and many of the leaders are right to point that out.
Well, so many of the victims in attacks like this turn out to be Muslim. In fact, the greatest cohort you'd say, if you look at all the attacks in the Middle East, victims would be Muslim faith. But Tim, just in relation to that Hansen tweet, do you accept that there'd be a big chunk of the population who'd empathise with her thoughts on that, given just how removed this seems from our Western, our Australian sensibility, this behaviour?
Kieran, what we need is honest conversations in this country. We've just heard how the majority of Muslims, of course, don't support terrorism and support the nation state and want to preserve our way of life in this country. There is a small section, but a not insignificant section of the community who do not share that view and are radicalised and will use any means to attack our country, our people, our Commonwealth and our sovereignty. We need to have that honest conversation with the public, because if we don't and we try and pretend that it doesn't exist or there's no relationship between that and a disturbing radical interpretation of Islam, there are people like Pauline Hanson who are out there ready to prey on that fear, and what they see is silence. What we shouldn't be is silent. What we should do is stand up and have that honest conversation with Australians to make sure that they know the politicians, the government are taking these concerns, these threats against our security very seriously. We will find the people who are responsible for extremism, and they are being dealt with. We have our agencies that are responsible and do go about the process of holding people to account. They intercept and stop attacks before they have occurred, and we've heard numbers of those already done. We will continue to do that and make sure we protect our country and our way of life.
Tim Wilson, Peter Khalil, appreciate your time, both of you, this Monday. We'll see you soon. A quick break, back in just a moment. My interview with Julie Bishop.